and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about relationship property agreements. These are essentially prenups we're talking about, also called contracting out agreements. Now, this is really important when you get into a relationship that if you've built up some assets or you plan to, that you are having conversations with your partner about, well, what happens if the unfortunate happens, if we do break up or we do separate or we do get divorced.
Perfect topic for the second date, in my opinion.
Well, we did talk about this in a separate episode, an earlier episode. We were talking about, well, what happens when you get divorced? But relationship property agreements are becoming more and more important here in New Zealand. And the reason is this. Back in 1970, the average age of marriage for a woman was 22 and for men it was 24. Now it's 31 for a woman and 33 for men. So it's 9 years later. And what that means is that we're coming into marriages and relationships with more and more assets. And of course, if more people are getting divorced, and we said previously that the average age of that was 45 or 47, if you're going into a new relationship at that age, then again, you're coming in with more assets. And so you've got more that you potentially want to protect.
Yeah, but the other part that's really important here is the de facto law. So I can't remember when this came in exactly, but I remember I was in school and I did an essay on it. And when they brought it in, it was to capture all those people who were in long-term committed relationships, but just weren't getting married. And actually, to be fair, I do think some of it was to do with same-sex marriages. So same-sex marriages weren't a thing back then. And so, if you were in a same-sex relationship, you couldn't get married, and so you didn't have that kind of safety net of the relationship property law. So I do think there's probably going to be some changes to the de facto relationships laws, and that has been kicked around now that we do have same-sex marriages. So the way de facto works, just in case anyone listening isn't aware, if you've been in a relationship for a number of years, then you're seen as married in the eyes of the law. New Zealand has a higher than average rate of people in de facto relationships compared to other countries. And so the way it works in New Zealand, generally speaking, is if you've been together and living together for 3 years, then you're considered married in the eyes of the law. And when it comes to relationship property, things can be split 50-50. Now, I can tell you from experience, 3 years can go pretty quick. And it might well be that you've just had someone move into your house, you move into your apartment, and a few years later, you can be sharing your assets with them, which you might not want to do.
Well, the key phrase here as well is living together as a couple. That is the phrase that is used. And that can be defined by different things and can be challenged down the road. So if you've got a partner and they're living with you maybe 4 or 5 nights a week and they've still got another place because they haven't moved out yet, then that line of where the 3 years starts can be challenged and up for definition later down the road.
But it's interesting. So in court, often things that will be referred to will be text messages or Facebook. So if you've put yourself in a relationship on Facebook, that might be referred to. Often you'll have testimony from friends saying whether or not you're in a relationship or not.
But here's the thing, let me ask you this. So say you and I are now a couple.
Your dream come true?
Well, we change our relationship status on Facebook.
Yes.
Does that count as the start of 3 years, even though you haven't asked me to move in with you yet?
Well, you probably just put a toothbrush in my house anyway and take a photo of it with today's newspaper to prove it. Look, it's one of those things that, a relationship doesn't necessarily mean you're living together. But again, there might be messages or there might be something like you've now had your mail delivered to my house, one of those really annoying things that all of a sudden I'm getting all your your Vodafone bills, and then something like that could be used as evidence.
And would it be if I send you a message saying, cool, I'll go pick up the ingredients for tonight's dinner, I'll be at home soon?
Yes. If I get a random message from you later on tonight saying I'm picking up the groceries, I'll know what you're up to.
Well, I'm coming over. I'm bringing over. I'm going to make my famous Thai green curry. Now, There are so many different things that the court may look at as well when deciding whether you are in de facto or not. There are a number of them, like how long you've been together and whether your friends consider you to be in a relationship, see you as a couple, whether you're being intimate and how household duties are shared. But let's move past those and talk about whether a relationship property agreement is right for you. Because I've heard with some friends who have got a number of assets that are now going into a relationship with someone who perhaps doesn't have as many assets, but they're still consciously making that decision and deciding that a relationship property agreement isn't right for them because they don't want to think of it in that way that it might end and don't want to put provisions in place.
And I actually think that that's not the right approach to have. I think that thinking about the possibility of a relationship ending is the right thing to do, and I can tell you now will make it a damn sight easier if you actually just kind of have an open discussion about this and lay it out. And look, if you say, hey, we're going to divide my assets even though you don't have any evenly, then just put that in writing and just have it there. And I can tell you with Lauren, my fiance now, she was insistent of me getting a relationship property agreement or us getting a relationship property right from the start because she knows that I'd had a blip or a challenge in the past, and so didn't want that to become an issue or that to be a consideration or a concern. And so, I think it is really the adult thing to do to have that conversation. And it's not about saying that, you don't love and trust each other. It's just saying, hey, let's just be sensible and think about how this might impact. And one of the really important things is if you're a business owner, you've got to consider the fact that actually you've got a responsibility to your business partners. I know that there's a company, and I won't mention their name, the local company that had a real challenge a couple of years ago when one of the directors had an affair. Now, the director's wife wasn't that excited about the affair and through relationship property wanted her share of that company. Now, what that did is put the company at risk because they needed to lend money to be able to pay her out. And so all of a sudden, if Eda and I are in business together and I've just been stupid and done something that's, put my finances at risk, now I drag Ed down with me.
The other thing that you've got to think about, even if you're the sole director of that company, is your responsibility to your staff as well. So if you put that company at risk with its finances, that has an impact on not just your staff, but their families as well. Now, let's pry into your personal life then, Andrew, because you are about to get married, and I know you're putting...
3 years from now. Well,
you've made the commitment.
Bought some time.
You've put the ring on it. And you're walking into this relationship with some assets. So how are you actually structuring this to separate those assets and say, hey, I'm going to have some which are relationship property, I'm going to have some which aren't?
Yep. So for us, and I'm sure Lauren won't mind me talking about this in front of all the audience. So we've got a family trust and we own our property, our own home, in that family trust. Now, anything that ends up in that trust is ours. That's relationship property. So the house is in there now. There's a mortgage on the house. We're paying down the mortgage. Any equity increases on the house are ours jointly. Now, we then use that property to leverage against, buy more rental properties. They too are relationship property.
Because they're in the family trust.
Correct. Now the reason we use the trust, by the way, is because I'm self-employed and so I'm more exposed to litigation than, someone that just has a job. Then I've got a business trust, or an investment trust actually is what it's called. And so that owns my shares in this company, for example. It owns shares in other property companies, any of those kind of things which I had prior to the relationship. Now, having them in a trust doesn't protect them from relationship property. You still have to have those in your contracting out agreement. So you need to have outlined those assets. And so things like investment properties I've owned previously, my companies, pieces of art, stuff like that, that's all protected from relationship property. Now, that doesn't mean that in the event of a separation, I can't provide more. It just means that we've drawn a line in the sand and then Lauren's got her own trust. And so that protects her assets that are there prior to the relationship.
What does the agreement say? Does it say in the event of the relationship ending, the business trust will go to Andrew?
It just
what does it say?
outlines your assets which are exempt from relationship property.
Okay, very, very interesting.
And you both have to have supplied those in advance of the agreement being signed. And so again, if, for example, the own home goes up in value and we buy another rental property that goes in there, then that's relationship property. If a property in the investment trust goes up in value and I buy a property from that equity, then that's not covered in relationship property because I'm using the equity or the cash that's in there to buy that. But you do have to be careful not to muddy the waters. So if I took some money out of my investment trust and then put it into the family trust and then I moved it back later, that triggers relationship property. And so all of a sudden I could be, that money could be seen to be relationship property. So you can't just go moving things back and forward.
So it sounds like you definitely want some advice from a legal team as you are moving money around to make sure that you're not contravening any agreements that you've got in place and muddying the waters in that instance. And this all sounds very intentional as well in terms of how you're thinking about this, Andrew. Do most people need to be thinking in this way, or is it only if you've got some assets that you're bringing into a relationship?
I just think it's sensible for anyone to have this conversation. Even if you don't have a huge amount to protect, if you've got stuff that you want to keep in the event of a separation, it's important to write this down. Even things that don't have a huge value, but they might have sentimental value. That can be a really important thing as well. Someone that I was talking to just last week has gone through a very messy separation, and his ex-wife isn't releasing furniture, and the furniture has no real value, but it's sentimental to him. So that's a real problem, and I think it should have just been outlined in the relationship property agreement.
Fascinating. Well, let's talk about the process for setting one up. The first thing is you've obviously got to get agreement that you're going to put one in place. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But then it sounds like we've got to put down what our assets are each and write them down and decide which are going to be exempt from relationship property and which are going to be relationship property. And an important step is that both parties have to get independent legal advice. You can't go to the same lawyer.
Yeah, this is a really interesting part. So in contract law in New Zealand, you can pretty much have a contract for anything and both parties sign on it, and you don't necessarily even need legal advice. Ed could assign his soul over to me right now just so we write it down. And
I thought that was in my employment agreement.
It is, and that's a binding agreement. Relationship property is different because there needs to be more provisions for protection around people because of the fact that it's, people can be emotionally manipulated, I guess. And so that's why in all instances you'll have an agreement and then both parties need to go and seek independent legal advice and sign off on that. Otherwise it can be challenged later.
And this is exactly the fact that I was going to move on to now, is that if it is too one-sided, and the court decides that when somebody's challenged it, it can be challenged and be undone at that point.
Yes, and this is where, again, you've got to be really sensible. So, again, you might put, and I'll go back to my example, in our agreement, there's certain provisions for changes in the way things are structured. So, for example, marriage is something that will change the way that assets are treated. Children is another trigger for those kind of things. Death is probably another one.
Have you set out what's going to happen at those stages?
Yes.
Okay, so it's already been pre-agreed as well. It's not a trigger to review.
No, but there is the ability to always have that conversation later on.
Now, something people often ask is, well, can I do it after the fact? So many people listening to this, no doubt, will be saying, I've been with my partner for 5 years. We've been living together as a couple. We're definitely de facto, and I didn't even mean to become de facto.
Yeah, I've been here.
Is it too late to put a relationship property agreement in place? And the answer is no, it's not too late.
That was actually news to me just recently. I've got a friend who is going through this, and I thought that because the time had, they've been together for a long time, I didn't realize you can actually have a completely binding relationship property agreement. And, he and his partner have been together for ages. They've always had an understanding. They just haven't formalized it. And I thought that it was too late, but actually they've been able to go to a lawyer now and outline, hey, look, he's had a couple of rental properties. She's got some other assets. Let's just, again, define that these are ours, these aren't relationship property, and everything we do from here forward is joint relationship property.
And I think that's very important because many people will go into relationships and they might have that conversation. Look, we'll both take out whatever we put into it and we'll split it based on both of our initial contributions. Now, when it comes to crunch time, if you don't have it written down in a contracting out agreement, people will change and people can change.
And this is a really important thing. I think that certainly if one party feels aggrieved in the separation or didn't want to get separated, then you can expect that they could potentially do things to kind of put the knife in. And, if she's run off with a younger man and you're feeling a bit annoyed, then you're probably going to try and go after all of her assets, or you'll try and lock up other assets. So this is where it's really important to deal with it at the start so that then this doesn't become an issue, particularly if you've got kids or you're going to have kids.
Most people listening to the show are now probably thinking, okay, I've got to get one of these in place. But how do I bring this up with my partner? It's a bit of an awkward thing. Now, Andrew, you and I are both lucky because Lauren brought it up for you. Kelly has always been very, very keen with me to get one in place. Smart
She
girl.
wants to keep your grubby hands off her assets.
Yeah, I'm sure that probably is the case. But if that's not the case, if you're not sure how your partner's going to take it, what do you do?
Well, this is a funny one because I've got a friend right now and he must be about 2 years into the 3-year potential window of de facto relationship, and he's now having this conversation. It's not going that well. And so, the kind of conversations that sometimes are had are things like, but I wouldn't take your assets and you love me and you trust me, so why would you need this in writing? Now, in this case, he's got other business ties, and like I said before, it is just responsible for him to have these in place. It's not the right thing for him to leave this kind of on the table undealt with. So maybe have a glass of wine, say, darling, I love you and I trust you, and I want to make sure that you're looked after in the event of our separation. Let's just talk about how we want to deal with that. If it ever happens, God forbid, and then start to write these things down and do as much as you possibly can without the lawyers. Write it all down, have a clear agreement in place, and then go and have a lawyer draft it and then both get the advice on it and sign it. And just remember, if you're the person sitting there and your partner's brought it up, no one's saying that they don't trust or love you. They're just saying you want to make sure that a separation, which is terrible it's the best of times, is as smooth as possible because they love and respect you.
And the last thing that I'd say as well is there is no harm in bringing it up as early as possible. Once you get into the second of the 3 years, or at the end of that second year, you're getting closer to the time. But if you bring it up much earlier, and I don't think the second date's a bad idea, Andrew. Well, maybe a little bit, but a 6-monther, I'd be perfectly, you got to drop those hints in early so they get used to the idea.
Ed, you're the type of person that's splitting the bill on the second date, so why not just make it a trifecta and bring up that as well?
Fantastic. Let's wrap it up there. But please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And of course, if you've got a topic that you'd like us to talk about, send us a text. Our number is 5522. If you whip out your phone, pop in a podcast topic in there. It'd be great to hear from you. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And we're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.